Sweetheart, grab me 2 creams and 1 sugar. And try not to spill it this time.
Sweetheart, grab me 2 creams and 1 sugar, and try not to spill it this time. The words landed in the open bullpen of the Westbrook Police Department's downtown precinct like a slap delivered in slow motion, audible to every officer, every dispatcher, every civilian witness sitting along the wooden benches by the front desk on a humid Tuesday morning in late June. The man who had spoken them, Deputy Chief Roland Mercer, did not look up from the open case file on his desk. He simply held out his porcelain mug, the one with the gold-rimmed Westbrook PD crest, and waited in the absolute confidence of a man who had spent 31 years assuming that the room would arrange itself around his preferences. The woman he had spoken those words to was standing in the doorway of his glass-walled office in a freshly pressed Navy uniform, her sergeant's stripes catching the overhead fluorescent light, her hair pulled back into the same disciplined low bun she had worn since her academy days. Her name was Lieutenant Marcella Booker. She was 38 years old, a 14-year veteran of the Westbrook Police Department, the top graduate of her FBI National Academy class, and the holder of 2 commendations for valor that Roland Mercer had personally tried to delay for 19 months apiece before the city council had quietly overruled him. She was also, although Roland Mercer did not know this and could not have known it on that humid Tuesday morning, the only person in that entire precinct who had read the confidential memo that the mayor's office had circulated to the city manager 48 hours earlier. She did not move toward the mug. She did not smile. She did not reach for the coffee pot on the credenza behind him. She simply stood in the doorway and let the silence stretch long enough for 2 officers in the bullpen to look up from their screens. What Roland Mercer did not know, what he could not possibly have known as he sat there with his arm extended, and his mug dangling from 2 fingers in a posture of theatrical impatience, was that within 72 hours the City Council of Westbrook would vote, 6-1, to confirm Marcella Booker as the next chief of police. He did not know that her name, not his, had already been entered into the official municipal database under the title Chief Designate, effective the 1st of July. He did not know that the case file open on his desk, the one he had been pretending to read while she stood waiting in his doorway, was the very file that her internal review team had been quietly building against him for the past 9 months. And he did not know, could not know, that the woman he had just ordered to fetch his coffee was about to become his direct supervisor. Before we step into one of the most extraordinary institutional reversals that the city of Westbrook had ever seen, I want to ask you something. Where in the world are you watching from right now? Drop your city in the comments below, because the diversity of places that gather around a story like this one is genuinely one of the best parts of this community, and we never take a single comment for granted. And if these opening minutes already have you leaning forward, do me a small favor and tap that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Stories about quiet competence finally meeting its moment, stories about the women who get underestimated until the day they decide not to be, those are the stories that deserve to travel the furthest. Now, let us pull back. Let us rewind to the morning of that coffee demand, and beyond it, to the slow 9-month accumulation of evidence, decisions, and quiet maneuvering that had brought Marcella Booker to stand in that doorway with the absolute composure of a woman who had already won, and was simply waiting for the rest of the room to find out. The morning had begun, for Marcella, the way most of her mornings began. She had risen at 4:45 in the small 2-bedroom bungalow she rented on the east side of Westbrook, a neighborhood that the city's real estate listings had begun cautiously describing as transitional, and that her own mother, a retired postal worker named Loretta Booker, had described for the past 60 years as simply home. She had run her 4 miles along the river path before sunrise, the way she had been running them since the academy, when a sergeant named Daniel Cho had told her that a black woman in a uniform would always be assumed to be less prepared than the man next to her, and that the only acceptable response was to make sure that she was, in fact, more prepared. She had showered. She had pressed her uniform. She had eaten a single slice of wheat toast, standing at her kitchen counter, while she reviewed 3 reports on her tablet. By 6:15, she had arrived at the precinct, the 3rd car in the lot after the overnight shift sergeant, and a young patrol officer named Devin Ortega, who had developed the habit of beating her to work by exactly 4 minutes in what she suspected, was a quiet, admiring competition that she had never acknowledged out loud, but which she found, in the privacy of her own thoughts, deeply endearing. She liked the quiet of the early precinct. She liked the way the linoleum floors of the second-floor hallway smelled of industrial wax before the day shift filled them with coffee, breath, and aftershave. She liked, most of all, the 90 minutes of uninterrupted work she could accomplish before Roland Mercer arrived at his desk at precisely 7:45, and the small theater of the department's daily politics began its first act. Roland Mercer had been the deputy chief of the Westbrook Police Department for 19 years. He had been a sergeant for 8 years before that, and a patrol officer for 9 years before that, and he had grown up in a household 3 blocks from the current precinct in a Westbrook that had looked, in the photographs his father had kept on the mantel, almost nothing like the Westbrook of the present day. His father had been a patrol officer. His grandfather had been a patrol officer. His older brother was a captain in a neighboring jurisdiction. The Mercer name, in the law enforcement circles of the Connecticut River Valley, carried a particular weight that Roland had been trading on for the entirety of his adult life, a weight that had grown, in his own estimation, into something close to entitlement. He believed that he should have been promoted to chief 11 years earlier when the previous chief had retired. He had not been. The position had gone instead to a thoughtful, soft-spoken man named Chief Howard Rennick, who had brought with him a reform agenda, a master's degree in public administration, and a willingness to promote officers based on demonstrated competence rather than the surnames printed on their pension paperwork. Chief Rennick had promoted Marcella Booker to sergeant in her 7th year on the force. He had promoted her to lieutenant in her 12th. He had, in a private conversation in his office 2 weeks before his unexpected diagnosis of stage 4 pancreatic cancer the previous autumn, told her plainly that he intended to recommend her as his successor when his 2nd term ended, which had originally been scheduled for the summer of the following year. Chief Rennick had died on a cold morning in late March, 9.5 weeks after that conversation, with the recommendation memo still sitting unsigned in the top drawer of his desk at home. His widow had found it, had read it, had wept briefly, and had then driven the memo personally to the office of the city manager. Marcella had attended the funeral in her dress uniform. She had stood in the back of the cathedral and had not cried, although she had felt, throughout the service, the particular ache of losing a man who had seen her clearly when very few other people in her professional life had ever bothered to look. Roland Mercer had stood in the front row, in his own dress uniform, beside Chief Rennick's widow, and had delivered a eulogy that had referred to Howard 4 separate times as a man who could have accomplished even more if he had only been willing to embrace tradition. Marcella had watched him say it. She had filed the observation away. What Roland Mercer had not known, on the afternoon of the funeral or in the weeks immediately following it, was that the recommendation memo had already been read by the city manager, then by the mayor, then by the chair of the city council's Public Safety Committee. He had not known that the memo had been accompanied, in its envelope, by a second document that Chief Rennick had quietly drafted in the final weeks of his life. That second document had been a confidential personnel assessment, 11 pages in length, in which Chief Rennick had laid out, with the careful precision of a man who knew his time was running out, his detailed concerns regarding the conduct of his deputy chief over the preceding decade. The document had cited 11 specific incidents. It had named 7 officers whose careers Roland Mercer had quietly stalled. It had described, in dry administrative language, a pattern of behavior that Chief Rennick believed disqualified Roland Mercer from any consideration as his successor. The city manager had read both documents twice. The mayor had read them once and had then made a phone call to the chair of the Public Safety Committee. By the end of the first week of April, a quiet, deliberate process had begun. The first phone call to Marcella had come on a Thursday evening, while she was reheating soup in her kitchen. The city manager, a thoughtful woman named Beatrice Aguilar who had served 3 mayors across 2 political parties without ever raising her voice in a public meeting, had asked Marcella whether she would be willing to participate in a confidential conversation about the future leadership of the department. Marcella had set down her spoon. She had said yes. The conversation had taken place the following Saturday morning in a small private conference room at the city manager's offices on the 4th floor of the municipal building. Beatriz Aguilar had been waiting at the door with a folder in her hand and a thermos of coffee on the table. The mayor, a careful man in his second term named David Whitlock, had arrived 12 minutes later. The chair of the Public Safety Committee, a retired judge named Alina Pham, had joined them by video conference from her home in the western suburbs because her husband had been recovering from hip surgery, and she had not wanted to leave him alone for the morning. The four of them had spoken for 2 hours and 20 minutes. Beatriz had laid out, in measured language, the contents of Chief Rennick's 2 memos. She had explained the timeline that the office was contemplating, a quiet internal review process that would run for several months, parallel to a formal national search that would be conducted in name only to satisfy the city charter's procedural requirements. She had explained that the review would need to be airtight, fully documented, and conducted in such a way that, when the final recommendation reached the city council, there would be no room for the kind of political maneuvering that Roland Mercer's allies in the regional law enforcement community would inevitably attempt to deploy. The mayor had spoken next. He had said in plain language that he had watched Marcella Booker for 11 years, that he had read her case files, that he had attended 3 of the community town halls she had organized in the neighborhoods east of the river, and that he believed, in the careful phrase he had chosen, that the time had come. Alina Pham, from the small square on the conference room screen, had said only this: "Lieutenant, I have known your mother since we were both 19 years old. She taught my youngest son to read at the Maplewood Library on Saturday mornings for 2 years when I was working too many hours. I have never asked her about you because that would not have been appropriate. I am asking you now. Are you ready?" Marcella had looked at the screen for a long moment. She had thought about Daniel Cho at the academy. She had thought about Howard Rennick in his office. She had thought about her mother, who had spent 41 years in a postal uniform, and who had never once in Marcella's memory taken a day off for an illness she could simply work through. She had thought about the 7 officers Howard Rennick had named in the second memo, 6 of whom she could identify on sight and 4 of whom she had personally watched flinch in meetings where Roland Mercer was the senior officer present. She had said, "Yes, ma'am, I am ready." The work had begun the following Monday. It had not been the kind of work that anyone in the precinct would have noticed. Marcella had continued her regular duties, had continued her quiet 4-mile runs at dawn, had continued her practice of arriving 90 minutes before her shift. But in the evenings, in the small back study of her bungalow that she had once converted from a second bedroom into a workspace, she had begun to assemble a documentary record of her deputy chief's conduct that had grown, over the course of the following 9 months, into a binder 3.5 inches thick. She had built it not with the heat of a person settling scores, but with the methodical care of a homicide detective building a prosecutable case, which was, in fact, exactly what she had been trained to do. She had pulled, through entirely lawful channels, and with the explicit written authorization of the city manager, the personnel files of every officer whose career had moved sideways under Roland Mercer's tenure as the department's second-in-command. She had cross-referenced internal affairs complaints against the disposition records that Roland had personally signed off on, and she had identified a pattern. Complaints filed by white officers against officers of color had been processed within an average of 23 days. Complaints filed by officers of color against white officers had been processed within an average of 211 days, with 63% of them resolved through a procedural mechanism that the department's own policy manual described as preliminary administrative closure, a designation that left the original complainant with no formal record of the matter and no avenue for appeal. She had built spreadsheets. She had built timelines. She had pulled body camera footage, dispatch logs, scheduling records, and the small administrative receipts that revealed which officers Roland had quietly assigned to the least desirable shifts in retaliation for raising procedural concerns in roll call. She had photocopied, scanned, and indexed every relevant document. She had organized the binder by category, by officer, and by date. She had labeled the spine in her careful handwriting. She had told no one in the precinct what she was doing. Not even her mother. She had, however, told 3 other people. Each had been chosen with the same deliberate care that had defined every other decision of the preceding months. The first was a woman named Carla Whitfield, the longtime executive assistant to the city manager, a woman in her late 50s who had worked in the municipal building for 26 years, and who knew, in a way that no organizational chart could ever capture, where every relevant document in the city's possession was filed, and how to retrieve it without triggering anyone's curiosity. Carla had agreed to serve as Marcella's quiet conduit for records requests that, if they had been submitted through normal channels, would have generated paperwork visible to anyone in the police department's administrative office. Carla had been doing this for 8 months. She had not missed a single request. She had also, on 3 separate occasions, slipped Marcella copies of internal memos that Roland Mercer had sent to the mayor's office requesting expanded disciplinary authority over lieutenants and below. Memos that Marcella had not been intended to see, and which had revealed, in Roland's own careful prose, the precise shape of the institutional power he had been quietly trying to consolidate in the months following Chief Rennick's diagnosis. The second was a man named Dr. Theodore Owens, a forensic psychologist who had served as the department's consulting clinician for 14 years, and who had administered the standardized leadership assessments for every officer who had been considered for command rank during that period. Marcella had requested, with Beatrice Aguilar's authorization, copies of every assessment Dr. Owens had ever conducted on the 7 officers Howard Rennick had named in his memo. The results had told a story so consistent that Dr. Owens, when he had personally walked Marcella through them in his small office above a flower shop in the South End, had said only, "Lieutenant, the data is the data. I have suspected for 9 years that something was happening that did not match the assessments. I am glad someone is finally asking." The third person was an old friend. His name was Anthony Reyes. He had graduated from the academy 2 classes ahead of Marcella, had served 7 years with the Westbrook Police Department, and had then, after one too many quiet humiliations administered by Roland Mercer in the form of canceled promotions and reassigned cases, had transferred to the state police, where he had risen, in the intervening decade, to the rank of major in the Internal Affairs Division. Marcella had not seen Anthony in 3 years when she had called him one Tuesday evening in early May from her kitchen table. She had said only that she was looking at something that might eventually require coordination with state-level investigators and that she wanted to know whether he would be the right person to call when the time came. Anthony had listened in silence for several seconds. Then he had said, "Marcella, I have been waiting for this phone call for 10 years, whatever you need, whenever you need it." She had said thank you. They had not spoken again for 6 months. By the time the calendar had turned to early June and the humidity had begun to settle over the Connecticut River Valley in the slow, heavy way that it always did in the weeks before the official start of summer, Marcella's binder had grown to its full thickness. The mayor had read it. The city manager had read it. Eleanor Pham had read it twice, once in her chambers and once at her kitchen table with a glass of iced tea and a yellow legal pad on which she had recorded in her precise judicial handwriting 14 separate observations. The decision had been made on a Thursday afternoon in the middle of June. The mayor, the city manager, and the chair of the Public Safety Committee had met privately in the mayor's conference room. They had reviewed the binder one final time. They had reviewed Marcella's own performance file, which Beatrice had separately compiled, and which contained letters of commendation from 3 different state agencies, 2 federal task forces, and the parents of a 14-year-old girl whom Marcella had personally walked out of a domestic hostage situation in the spring of her 5th year on the force. They had reviewed the results of the formal national search, which had produced 2 external candidates of acceptable but unremarkable qualifications, and had confirmed, in the dry language of the search committee's report, that the strongest candidate by every measurable criterion was already on the department's own roster. The vote had been taken. The recommendation had been drafted. The mayor had signed it on a Friday morning. The formal city council vote had been scheduled for the following Friday, 10 days later. The intervening 10 days had been required to satisfy public notice requirements under the city charter. During those 10 days, the recommendation would remain confidential, accessible only to the council members themselves, the mayor's office, the city manager, and a small handful of administrative staff who had signed non-disclosure agreements as a condition of their employment. The coffee demand happened on the morning of day 4 of those 10 days. Section 510, she had stood in that doorway on that humid Tuesday morning with her hands clasped lightly behind her back, in the standard parade-dressed position she had carried since the academy, and she had let the silence in Roland Mercer's office grow long enough for him to finally look up from the case file on his desk. When he had, his expression had registered a small flicker of confusion that had been replaced almost immediately by the practiced impatience of a man who had been getting his way for 31 years without interruption. "Lieutenant," he had said, holding the mug a quarter-inch higher. "2 creams, 1 sugar. The coffee maker in the break room is broken again. The one in the captain's office still works." The captain's office was on the same floor, 14 feet down the hallway. Roland Mercer was perfectly capable of walking those 14 feet. He had walked them 3 times the previous day to refill his own mug, on each occasion stopping to make a small joke with the dispatch supervisor, and to laugh at his own joke with the easy confidence of a man whose laughter was always returned in kind. The fact that he had now decided, on this particular morning, in the presence of the only black female lieutenant in the building and the small audience of officers in the bullpen behind her, that the coffee was somehow her responsibility was a decision he had made entirely on his own, in real time, for reasons that Marcella did not need to articulate because they articulated themselves. She had spoken then, in the same level professional tone she used in roll call. "Deputy Chief, I'm not available to bring you coffee. I came up to discuss the Henley case briefing for the 10 o'clock with the prosecutor's office. If you'd like to reschedule, I can come back this afternoon." Roland Mercer had set the mug down on his desk with a small, deliberate click. The 2 officers in the bullpen had stopped pretending not to listen. A young records clerk named Janelle Foster, 23 years old and 3 months into her first municipal job, had quietly slid her phone out from beneath the lip of her desk and had begun, with the practiced steadiness of a generation that had grown up understanding exactly what kind of moments were worth preserving, to record video. "Lieutenant," Roland had said. He had drawn the syllables out. "I don't think you understood me. I'm not asking." She had looked at him for a moment longer. Then she had said with the same even composure, "I understood you perfectly, Deputy Chief. My answer is the same." There had been a pause. What had happened next would later be described in the official summary of the internal review that Beatrice Aguilar would order before the close of business that day, as a sustained verbal disparagement of a subordinate officer in the presence of multiple witnesses. The summary would not capture the way Roland Mercer had risen from his chair with the slow theatrical care of a man performing his own outrage for the benefit of the room. It would not capture the precise wording of the sentence in which he had described her as having forgotten her place. It would not capture the moment when he had stepped around the side of his desk and had pointed at the doorway with 2 extended fingers and had told her, in a voice loud enough to carry the full length of the second-floor hallway, that if she could not handle the basic professional courtesy of bringing a senior officer a cup of coffee, then she clearly did not have the temperament for command, and that he would be personally recommending to the new chief, whoever that might turn out to be, that her name be removed from any future promotional consideration. Marcella had not moved, she had not blinked, she had let him finish. When he had finished, she had said only, "Thank you for your candor, Deputy Chief. I'll see you at the 10 o'clock. Then she had turned and walked the length of the second-floor hallway at her normal pace, down the stairs, past the front desk, where a civilian witness on the wooden bench had quietly stopped him to ask, "Ma'am, are you all right?" And to which she had answered with a small, genuine smile, "Yes, sir. I appreciate you asking. Have a good morning." She had walked out the front door of the precinct. She had crossed the small concrete plaza. She had climbed into her department-issued sedan in the assigned lieutenant's parking space. She had gripped the steering wheel for a moment with both hands and exhaled slowly all the way out. Then she had pulled her phone from the inside pocket of her uniform jacket and had made one phone call. The call had lasted 41 seconds. Beatrice Aguilar had picked up on the first ring. "Beatrice, it happened. There were at least 4 witnesses, and I believe at least one of them was recording." There had been a beat of silence on the other end of the line. Then Beatrice Aguilar had said, in the careful, low voice that she reserved for moments of consequence, "Lieutenant, drive to the municipal building. We're moving the vote." The drive from the precinct to the municipal building took her 11 minutes in light mid-morning traffic. She did not turn on the radio. She did not call her mother. She drove the route she had driven 1,000 times before, past the small brick library where her mother had once taught Alina Pham's son to read, past the corner bodega where she had bought her first pack of gum at the age of 7, past the long row of 2-story homes that had been built in the 1920s for the millworkers, and that now housed 3 generations of families who had quietly held the eastern half of Westbrook together through 40 years of municipal neglect. She let the city slide past her windows. She let her hands rest on the steering wheel. She let herself feel, for the first time in 9 months, the slow, steady weight of what was about to happen. What was about to happen was that the recommendation that had been scheduled to come before the city council on the following Friday would now be moved forward by 6 days. Beatriz Aguilar had made the decision in the 41 seconds between Marcella's call and the ending of it, and she had begun the necessary phone calls before Marcella's sedan had cleared the precinct's parking lot. The mayor had been pulled out of a budget meeting on the 3rd floor of the municipal building. Alina Pham had been called at her home and had agreed, without hesitation, to drive into the city for an emergency session. The remaining members of the Public Safety Committee had been contacted by Carla Whitfield in the deliberate order that had been pre-planned for exactly this kind of contingency, beginning with the 2 members who had already privately confirmed their support and ending with the 1 member, a longtime city councilman named Richard Galway, who had been Roland Mercer's most reliable institutional ally for the past 16 years. Councilman Galway had been the only no vote when the formal council session had finally convened that Friday morning. He had cast it with the resigned grimace of a man who had already received, by Wednesday evening, 3 separate phone calls from constituents in his own ward who had seen the video that Janelle Foster had uploaded to her personal account on Tuesday afternoon, and which had been viewed, by the time the council session began, slightly more than 400,000 times. But that vote was still 3 days away. On the morning of the coffee incident, Marcella did not yet know that the timeline would compress so quickly. She knew only what Beatriz had told her on the phone: drive to the municipal building. We are moving the vote. She drove. She parked in the visitor lot. She walked through the glass doors of the lobby and rode the elevator to the 4th floor, and Carla Whitfield met her at the elevator with a small nod and walked her down the carpeted hallway to the same private conference room where the original conversation had taken place 9 months earlier. The room was already filling. The mayor was on the phone in the corner, his back to the door, speaking in the clipped, quiet tone he reserved for conversations he did not want overheard. Beatriz was at the head of the table with 2 folders open in front of her. A man Marcella did not recognize, a lawyer in his 50s with a soft handshake and a precise haircut, introduced himself as Daniel Frost, special counsel to the city, retained that morning at Beatriz's direct request. Alina Pham was on the screen at the far end of the table, the same square, the same kitchen behind her, the same yellow legal pad in her hand. A second screen had been added to the wall. On it was the face of a woman Marcella did know, a federal prosecutor named Helena Brooks who had worked with the Westbrook Department on 3 multi-agency task forces over the previous decade and who had grown up, as it happened, on the same block as Marcella's older cousin. Helena Brooks did not waste time with greetings. She simply said, "Lieutenant, walk me through this morning, slowly, every detail you can remember. There are at least 3 federal claims sitting inside what you are about to describe, and I want to make sure we capture them cleanly before we go any further." Marcella sat down. She accepted a glass of water from Carla Whitfield. And then, in the careful, complete, methodical way she had been taught to give testimony at the Academy 14 years earlier, she walked Helena Brooks through every word, every gesture, every face in the bullpen, every position of every witness, and every second of the encounter she had just survived. It took her 23 minutes. When she was finished, Helena Brooks set down her pen and looked for a long moment at the city manager. "Beatriz," she said, "he just handed you everything." Back at the precinct, Roland Mercer had spent the first hour after Marcella's departure congratulating himself in the small, private way that men like Roland Mercer congratulated themselves in the aftermath of moments they believed they had won. He had refilled his own coffee from the captain's office. He had returned to his desk. He had made 2 phone calls to old friends in the regional law enforcement community in which he had described, with a tone of weary patriarchal disappointment, the morning's incident as evidence of the broader problem with the modern department, by which he had meant, although he had not said so out loud, the broader problem of a department that had begun to be staffed by people who did not look like him. Both of his old friends had murmured their sympathetic agreement. Both of them would, within 72 hours, stop returning his calls entirely. He had emerged from his office at approximately 10:35 to find that the 10 o'clock briefing with the prosecutor's office had taken place without him. Marcella had not been there either, but the assistant district attorney had been competently briefed by a sergeant named Aaliyah Green, whose name Roland had been quietly trying to keep off the upcoming promotional list for the previous 14 months, and who had evidently been more than capable of running the meeting in Marcella's absence. The Henley case briefing had taken 38 minutes. The prosecutor had left the precinct with a clean-signed coordination memo. The case had moved forward without any of Roland Mercer's involvement. He had not yet noticed that Janelle Foster's video had been online for 2.5 hours. He had not noticed it because he had spent the morning with his office door closed and his phone face down on his desk, in the deliberate manner of a man who believed that the world should adjust itself to his schedule rather than the reverse. He would not notice it until 2 minutes past noon, when his daughter, a 19-year-old college student named Caitlin, who was home for the summer and who had been scrolling through her social media feeds at her summer internship in Hartford, sent him a text message that read only, "Dad, what did you do?" He had read the text. He had set the phone down. He had picked it up again. He had opened the link his daughter had forwarded. The video was 47 seconds long. It captured the precise moment of his pointed fingers, the precise wording of his sentence about temperament for command, the precise composure with which Marcella had received it. It had been uploaded with no commentary, no caption beyond the location tag for the Westbrook Municipal Complex, and no editorializing of any kind. It did not need any. The footage spoke clearly enough on its own. By the time Roland Mercer watched it for the first time, the video had been viewed 214,000 times. By the time he watched it for the second time, 10 minutes later, that number had crossed 300,000. His phone began to ring at 12:41. The first call was from a regional television reporter named Kendra Usu, who had been covering the Westbrook Municipal beat for 9 years, and who had been quietly told by a contact in the mayor's office the previous evening that she might want to be available for breaking developments in the city in the coming days. The second call was from a representative of the Connecticut State Chapter of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, who had received the video forwarded directly by 3 separate community members within 90 minutes of its initial upload. The third call was from his ex-wife, the mother of his college-aged daughter, who had not spoken to him voluntarily in 7 years, and whose message, when he finally listened to it that evening, had consisted of the words, "Roland. Caitlin called me crying. You should have known better. You should have always known better." He did not answer any of the 3 calls. He sat at his desk in his glass-walled office on the 2nd floor of the precinct and refreshed the news sites and felt, for the first time in his 31-year career, the slow, nauseous understanding that he had walked into a room he could not walk out of. At 1:15, the captain who had been Roland Mercer's most loyal subordinate for 11 years, a man named Bradley Chanowski, knocked on his office door and did not wait for permission to enter. He had a folded copy of an internal memo in his hand. He had received it through the department's confidential personnel notification system 7 minutes earlier. The memo announced that Lieutenant Marcella Booker had been placed, effective immediately, on protected administrative leave pending the outcome of a city-initiated review, and that all department personnel were instructed to direct any inquiries regarding the morning's incident to the city manager's office. Captain Chanowski set the memo on Roland's desk. He said, "Roland, I think you need a lawyer." The 72 hours between Tuesday afternoon and the emergency Friday council session compressed themselves, in Roland Mercer's experience of them, into a single continuous fluorescent-lit hallway that he could not seem to find his way out of. He retained the lawyer that Captain Chanowski had recommended, a thin, careful man in his 60s named Howard Vine, who arrived at Rowland's home on Tuesday evening with a yellow legal pad and a series of questions that Rowland answered with a defensive irritation that Howard Vine had seen in the course of his career in approximately 420 other clients, and which he knew from extensive professional experience. Was the single most reliable predictor of a case that was about to become very expensive. Howard Vine had told Rowland 3 things that first evening. The first was that he was not, under any circumstances, to communicate with Lieutenant Booker either directly or indirectly. The second was that he was not to give any press statements, post any social media commentary, or speak to any colleague outside of the formal chain of command. The third was that he was to begin, immediately, writing down a complete account of his interactions with Lieutenant Booker over the entirety of her career at the department, because the city manager's office was almost certainly already in the process of doing exactly that. And Howard Vine wanted to know what he was working with before the city's version of the record was the only version that existed. Rowland had agreed to all 3. He had violated all 3 within 48 hours. On Wednesday morning, he had sent Marcella a text message at 6:43 in the morning that read, "Lieutenant, we need to talk before this gets out of hand. Rowland." Marcella had not opened the message. Her phone had been turned over to Daniel Frost, the special counsel, by 10 o'clock the previous evening, and Daniel Frost had photographed the message on the locked screen, time-stamped, and added it to a file that was rapidly becoming its own 3-inch binder. On Wednesday afternoon, Rowland had called a regional law enforcement podcast host named Greg Haverson, with whom he had appeared on 3 previous occasions, and had spoken on the record, for 11 minutes, about what he described as the dangers of social media mob justice in modern policing. The episode had aired on Thursday morning. By Thursday afternoon, it had been shared, with extensive critical commentary, across every major civic discussion forum in the state. On Thursday evening, Rowland had attended his weekly dinner with his older brother, the captain in the neighboring jurisdiction, and had spent the dinner explaining, in increasingly elevated tones, why the entire incident was being engineered against him by a political faction inside the Westbrook municipal government that had been gunning for him since the previous chief's funeral. His older brother had listened. His older brother had paid the check. His older brother had driven home and had then, after a long, quiet hour at his own kitchen table, called Howard Vine personally to ask whether his brother understood the gravity of the situation he was now in. Howard Vine had said, with the careful weariness of a man who had been doing this work for 40 years, that he was not sure. The emergency city council session convened at 10 o'clock on Friday morning in the main council chambers on the 2nd floor of the municipal building. The chambers were full. Local media had been notified, in accordance with public meeting requirements, 24 hours earlier. 3 regional television stations had set up cameras along the back wall. Kendra Wusu was seated in the front row of the press section with her notepad open and her pen uncapped. Janelle Foster, the record's clerk whose video had begun the cascade, was seated in the public gallery beside her own mother, a hospice nurse named Yvette Foster who had taken the morning off work to be there. Marcella's mother, Loretta Booker, was seated 3 rows behind Yvette, in the same navy blue church dress she had worn to Marcella's academy graduation 14 years earlier. The mayor opened the session at 10:02. He read into the official record the formal recommendation of the city manager's office for the appointment of Lieutenant Marcella Booker to the position of Chief of Police of the Westbrook Police Department, effective the 1st of July. He summarized, in measured language, the results of the national search and the conclusions of the internal review process. He acknowledged, in a single careful sentence, that recent events had accelerated the timeline for the council's consideration, and he asked the chair of the Public Safety Committee to provide her formal report. Eleanor Pham, present in person for the first time in 14 months because her husband's recovery had reached the point where she could leave him for a morning, walked to the podium. She read, in her measured judicial voice, a 4-minute summary of the Public Safety Committee's unanimous recommendation. She did not name Rowland Mercer. She did not need to. The vote was called at 10:26. It passed 6-1. The swearing-in took place 14 minutes after the vote. Marcella stood at the front of the council chambers in her dress uniform, the same uniform she had pressed at her own kitchen counter at 4:30 that morning, and she raised her right hand and repeated the oath in a clear, steady voice that carried to the back of the chambers without need of the microphone. Eleanor Pham administered the oath. Loretta Booker, 3 rows back, did not wipe the tears from her cheeks because she had never, in 59 years, considered tears on her own face to be a thing that required apology. Beatrice Aguilar watched from the side of the chambers with her arms folded across her folder of contingency plans, none of which she had needed to deploy, and she allowed herself, for the first time in 9 months, a small private smile. Marcella did not give a speech. She had decided the previous evening that the moment did not require one. She thanked the council. She thanked the mayor. She thanked the residents of Westbrook for the trust they had placed in her. She said that she looked forward to the work ahead. Then she stepped down from the platform, crossed the chambers, and embraced her mother in the second row in the kind of long, full embrace that did not require any words and which Loretta Booker would describe, that evening on the phone to her own sister, as the proudest moment of her entire long life. By 11:15, Chief Marcella Booker was back in her department-issued sedan, driving the 11-minute route from the municipal building to the precinct. This time, she did turn on the radio. She did not turn it on for the music. She turned it on because the local public radio station was carrying live coverage of the council session, and she wanted to hear in someone else's voice the precise wording of what had just happened. The reporter described it carefully, historic, unanimous within the Public Safety Committee, the youngest chief in the department's 142-year history, the first black woman to hold the position. The reporter did not use the word reversal. The reporter did not need to. Every listener in Westbrook understood by Friday at 11:15 in the morning exactly what kind of reversal had occurred. She pulled into the precinct lot at 11:26. Devin Ortega, the young patrol officer who had spent the previous 14 months arriving 4 minutes ahead of her every morning, was standing at the front entrance in his crisp uniform with his hat in his hands. He was not the only one. Behind him, lined along the small concrete plaza in 2 careful unofficial rows, stood approximately 40 officers of the Westbrook Police Department, including every officer whose name had appeared on Howard Rennick's confidential memo, including Sergeant Aaliyah Green, including Captain Bradley Chenowski, who had spent the previous 36 hours undergoing a private reckoning of his own, and who had decided, that morning over coffee at his own kitchen table, that he would rather stand in the right line at the right moment than spend the remainder of his career standing in the wrong one. None of these officers had been ordered to be present. None of them had been invited. They had simply, in the quiet word-of-mouth way that things move through police departments, decided. Marcella stepped out of the sedan. She walked the length of the concrete plaza. She greeted each officer by name. She accepted from Devin Ortega a small folded paper card on which he had written, in his careful patrol officer's handwriting, "Chief, we have been waiting." She tucked the card into the inside pocket of her uniform jacket. She would keep it there for the rest of the day, and later that evening, when she returned to her small bungalow on the east side, she would place it on the mantel above the small fireplace beside the photograph of her grandmother who had died when Marcella was 11 years old, and who had once told her, on a Sunday afternoon in her own kitchen, that the trick to life was to do the work whether anyone was looking or not, because the moment always came eventually when someone was. She walked through the front doors of the precinct at 11:34. Roland Mercer was in his office on the second floor. He had been told, by Captain Chenowski, that morning that the council session was likely to produce an announcement that would affect his employment status, and he had decided, with the particular stubbornness of a man who had spent 31 years refusing to leave rooms he had not been formally ejected from, to come into work anyway. He was sitting at his desk with his hands folded in front of him, and his door closed when he heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps in the second-floor hallway, more than a few pairs of footsteps, moving with the unhurried purpose of people who had a clear destination. The footsteps stopped outside his office door. The door opened without a knock. Marcella stepped through it first, followed by Daniel Frost, the special counsel followed by Captain Chenowski, followed by 2 officers from the city's internal review team whom Roland had never personally met but whose presence in his doorway he understood, instantly and completely, the way drowning men understand water. He did not stand up. He did not speak. He simply looked at the woman he had ordered 72 hours earlier to bring him a cup of coffee, and he watched the slow, comprehensive shape of his own institutional life rearrange itself in real time across the small distance of his desk. Marcella did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "Deputy Chief Mercer," she said. "Effective immediately, you are placed on unpaid administrative suspension pending the outcome of the city's formal review. Mr. Frost will walk you through the terms of your suspension and the conditions of your continued cooperation. You are required to surrender your service weapon, your department-issued credentials, your vehicle, and your access card to this building before you leave the premises today. Captain Chenowski will accompany you to your locker and to your vehicle to ensure that all departmental property is returned in accordance with policy. You will receive a formal letter at your home address by close of business tomorrow detailing the specific charges under review and your rights of response. Do you have any questions?" Roland Mercer did not have any questions. He had a great many questions, but he understood, with the same clarity that had arrived at his desk along with the footsteps in the hallway, that none of those questions would be answered in this room on this morning by this woman. He stood up slowly. He unclipped his badge. He set it on the desk. He unholstered his service weapon, cleared the chamber with the practiced motion of 31 years of habit, and placed it on the desk beside the badge. He did not look at Marcella as he did it. He looked instead at the small framed photograph on the corner of his desk, a photograph of his father in his own patrol uniform from 1972, a photograph that had hung in 3 different offices over the course of Roland's career and which had served, in his own quiet understanding of his life, as both anchor and inheritance. He picked up the photograph. He tucked it under his arm. He walked past Marcella and out of the office without speaking. That had been the easy part. The harder part, the part that unfolded over the subsequent 18 months, included the formal city review that resulted in his termination for cause 6 weeks later. It included the federal civil rights investigation that Helena Brooks opened the following Monday morning, and that produced, 11 months after that, a consent decree with the Westbrook Police Department that committed the city to extensive reforms in promotional review, internal affairs processing, and disciplinary documentation. It included the civil settlement that the city reached the following spring, with 3 of the 7 officers whose names had appeared in Howard Rennick's original memo, each of whom had filed parallel suits with the assistance of a small civil rights firm, whose retainer had been quietly funded by an anonymous donor, whose identity was never publicly confirmed, but whom Carla Whitfield, in the privacy of her own retirement 2 years later, would acknowledge having helped to coordinate. It included Roland Mercer's loss of his state law enforcement certification, his loss of his pension multiplier, and his eventual quiet relocation to a small town in central Pennsylvania, where he took a position as a private security consultant at a regional shopping mall, and where, when reporters occasionally called for comment in the years that followed, he no longer answered the phone. It included, on the other side of the ledger, the rise of Chief Marcella Booker into one of the most quietly respected municipal police executives in the Northeast region of the United States. She served 2 full terms. She rebuilt the department's promotional review system from the ground up. She established the Howard Rennick Memorial Scholarship for Community Policing, which she funded out of her own salary for the first 3 years until private donors stepped in to sustain it, and which paid full tuition for residents of the eastern neighborhoods of Westbrook to attend the Regional Police Academy. She hired Aaliyah Green as her own deputy chief in the 2nd year of her first term. She promoted Devin Ortega to sergeant in the 3rd year, to lieutenant in the 7th, and on her own last day in office, she pinned his captain's bars on him personally in a small ceremony attended by his wife, his children, and the now-retired Carla Whitfield, who had served as the unofficial historian of the entire long arc of the department's quiet transformation. If this story moved you, hit that like button before you scroll away. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications because we tell stories like this one every single week. Drop a comment below and tell us about a moment in your own life when you were quietly underestimated and what you did about it. We read every single comment, And remember, the people who try to put you in your place are almost always the ones standing in a place they never earned. Keep doing the work. Keep documenting. Keep your name where it belongs. We will see you in the next story. Peace.